All right, today's topic, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Usually, if you were to look at a timeline, they separate the two into two distinct art movements, but the reason I put them together is, well, one, they have virtually the same name, but they also closely relate and associate with each other in a number of occasions. So what is it? Of course, Impressionism is an art movement that formed in France in the late 19th century and is largely categorized by its use of small yet visible brushstrokes. It's also well known for its compositions and a very accurate depiction of light over form. And in its beginning, it was harshly criticized because, again, this was largely unconventional for the time and it had a heavy rejection of modern practices. Considering the most recent art movement prior to Impressionism was realism, many were very against this. Because yes, while it did have a realist position, very good compositions and light fixtures, it was largely uncharacteristic to have such visible brushstrokes. Again, the term impressionist actually began as a criticism of it, considering the first piece to really exhibit impressionist styles was Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, to which Louis Leroy, in a satirical review, called it an impressionist piece. It's also important to note that Impressionism is interesting that it drew from much different cultural aspects. Specifically, for a lot of late Impressionist and early post-Impressionist pieces, they drew on Japanese ukiyo-e paints, which are very stylized woodblock prints. And then we get to Post-Impressionism. The movement itself began as an extension and largely further development of the Impressionist movement itself. And it recycled a lot of aspects and elements from the Impressionist period. Of course, Post-Impressionism stands out in that it largely varied from artist to artist, considering a lot of the artists did not know exactly how to truly express it, such as this Van Gogh piece here, and, of course, varying styles would develop, such as Pointillism by Georges Seurat. And, of course, as you could tell from Post-Impressionism from Impressionism, this did not focus more on form. Again, it was more a use of color, lighting, and a more expression in it. Although not expressionism, it would focus more on emotion. When was it? Of course, Impressionism would start sometime in the 1870s due to independent exhibitions presented by Paris-based artists at the time. The peak of the movement would last until the 1880s, when it largely fell out of form with the French art community. Of course, at this time in the 1880s and 70s, people dressed like this. Very fun time to be alive. Post-Impressionism. Of course, Post-Impressionism followed Impressionism, so beginning in the late 1880s and up until the birth of Fauvism in France in the early 1900s, it would continue on, although the peak of the movement was during this time from the 1880s to the 1900s. There were isolated incidents, of course, throughout Europe. Yeah, again, people dressed like this. This guy was dead, considering it was the early 1900s. And then we go on to where was it? As you can tell at this point, Europe is beginning to look much more like its modern counterpart, although we still got some outliers. Both Impressionism and Post-Impressionism started in France and then gradually spread to the rest of Europe due to its, well, while it was initially criticized, it did really take off with more modern artists, as they found it very popular and a very detachment from what was normal at the time. Of course, it wouldn't exactly spread as far as other styles, seeing as how it only reached about as far as the Netherlands. And most of the well-known Impressionist and Post-Impressionist pieces came out of Europe. Yeah. Of course, the country would fall apart and put itself back together again eventually. Trivia. So, one of the most influential and famous figures of the Post-Impressionist movement was Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh's life was basically a story of consistently bad things happening to one guy, but of course, a fascinating study altogether. But one of these interesting aspects is that despite Van Gogh's skill and later on appraisal, he started art at a much later age than most famous artists do. So, that being said, what age do you guys believe he began painting? Nope.
27.
Yes.
Oh my.
He started painting at 27 after a number of failed jobs prior. Weirdly enough, most people who, prior to Van Gogh at least, who are well recognized for their art, largely began painting at least in their early teens. especially once they started going to specified schools for it. Famous practitioners. As I previously stated, the Claude Monet piece, Impression Sunrise, as depicted here, is what really kicked off the Impressionist movement altogether. Also, Claude Monet is the founder and, arguably the most prominent figure of the Impressionist movement. While studying to become an artist and improve his craft, Monet would pick up a large part of course, Die Afrika Chasseurs. It's a weird part of history. And of course, for a period of a year, Claude Monet also served in the military. Interesting lifestyle together. But after leaving the military, he would contract typhoid and family intervention. He would attend a real art school. Very fun life to live altogether. And although he was disillusioned, as they called him, with the modern art practices of the time, he would focus on a large rejection of his in plein air art style, which is, an emphasis on the natural. Again, more realistic light textures rather than realistic form. And then we move to Edgar Degas, another incredibly important figure of the Impressionist art movement. Although it's said Degas began during the Impressionist period, he preferred to be called a realist, despite the obvious. Of course, despite numerous detractors in his life, such as his anti-Semitism and poor eyesight, he would become incredibly prominent in the French art community because of his skill and later family connections. Again, it could be argued he was a realist, but given the brushstrokes and form altogether, it was largely argued he was an impressionist. Then, of course, we get to arguably the most prominent figure of the post-impressionist movement, Vincent Willem van Gogh. Van Gogh is a Dutch impressionist painter who is considered roughly one of the greatest post-impressionist painter, if not one of the greatest artists of all time. Van Gogh would spend much of his early years as an art dealer and later a Protestant missionary in Belgium, although after the hilarious failure of this and many other careers, he began his painting career. Although plagued by mental illness and a multitude of other factors in his life, he would, of course, produce a number of very prominent pieces. Although his life did not balance out well with the beauty of these pieces, considering at some point he would also, in a manic state, lop his own left earlobe off after an argument with his friend Paul Gauguin, another famous painter, that is. Of course, Van Gogh would be admitted to a number of mental institutions until he committed suicide at 37 after a life of constant poverty and depression. Here is a piece Van Gogh created. Of course, it's based on an ukiyo-e wood print, which shows the Dutch's deep connections to Japanese history, but also the influence Japanese art itself played on Impressionists at the time. Here, of course, we have a picture of his room. Well, not a picture, a painting. And roughly his most iconic piece, Starry Night, that he painted while in Saint Remy, the mental institution, of course. And it is important to note that a lot of the paints here are very unconventional even for the post-impressionist period, considering much of the paint was a mixture of whatever paints he could gather and whatever materials he could find on hand in a mental institution, of course. It's fascinating to look at what is actually piecing all of this together. And then, of course, we come up to Georges-Pierre Seurat. Seurat's a famous post-impressionist painter who is well known for, while being a post-impressionist, largely rejecting a point of its style, and instead focusing on what he has developed as pointillism, which, of course, is a mastering of color theory and form to piece together a number of points to create a full piece. Of course, this thing is huge. It's easily, what would you say?
It's like the size of that bulletin board right there.
Yes. And of course, up close, it's hard to tell what it is. It's just a bunch of dots, but of course that requires you to step back. Of course, his most famous piece on the island of Sunday on the island of Le Grand Jurat. Although his prominence and master of color theory, he would die at the age of 31, with his sons dying 2 weeks later from the same disease as him. Although we don't really know what it was, it's thought to be either diphtheria or meningitis. Historical significance. The significance of both Impressionism and Post-Impressionism is to largely say that it was a move from what was conventional at the time. It's where we see a more active rejection of modern practices at the time, and it's also where we begin to see a development of what we would consider modern art at the time. And it's also where we show a deep appreciation for something that was harshly criticized at the time, although as time progressed, we were able to see the true value in it rather than what we base it on compared to its predecessors. Considering as well, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism led to the development of some of the most valuable and groundbreaking, if you would, pieces of artwork that we have for the modern era. And we have some examples. Another pointillist piece. Again, they were very expressive with some of these. And we get to our resources. Anybody got questions? Beth. That painting itself, I am not too sure of it. It was most likely Paul Gauguin, but it's hard to distinguish because a lot of early Impressionist pieces sort of follow a uniform style of visible brushstrokes. Yes?
So before Impressionism, people, or whenever it first started, they criticized it
Oh, they hated it.
because it wasn't realistic.
Yes. Prior to Impressionism, realism was the dominating style at the time. So considering what Impressionism offered, they largely criticized it as an ugly, childish art style. Although this would not be the first time this would happen, it's definitely not the last. Considering Fauvism and many other styles like it would follow in the same footsteps of being harshly criticized in the beginning, but thanks to their innate talent and what they offered as a groundbreaking, more antithetical style to what was popular at the time, would become later, well, popular later on.